Engineering Department with the Institute of National Security. And I want to welcome everybody to Howard Baker Center. Just as a footnote there, Howard Baker is here, Junior is here. He's upstairs at the board meeting, so he's in the building. So I just want to welcome everybody to Howard Baker Center. Now, Brown Bag series at the Institute of National Security. And I do have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Carl Van Mauney. We know him as Van Mauney at Waxwell Security Complex. I say we because I just retired from Waxwell and joined the University of Tennessee, so I have the pleasure of introducing him. So he doesn't want me to read his whole bio, so I'm going to skip around a little bit and try to catch most of it because it's really all good stuff. So Carl Van is the Vice President of Program Management at Waxwell National Security Complex. He directs management of Waxwell's programs that help sustain the nation's nuclear deterrent, reduce the threat posed by nuclear proliferation and terrorism, and provide material for reliable fuel supply, especially for the U.S. Navy. He oversees planning and especially that budget execution, which is, I know is a big challenge there at Waxwell, and the integration of all programs relative to nuclear weapons. Waxwell's facility infrastructure, which is a huge challenge there at Waxwell, uranium supply and disposition, nuclear nonproliferation, environmental management work with other fellow agencies in the private industry. Additional responsibilities include partnerships like the Institute of Nuclear Security, develop and use advanced technologies developed at Waxwell, in addition to improving the efficiency and effectiveness of Waxwell production processes, especially with the impending and upcoming UPF, uranium processing facility. One of his responsibilities, and these technologies strengthen the science, technology, and engineering competencies that are important elements of the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration. Joining the Waxwell team in 2011, after retiring from the U.S. Navy with the rank of Vice Admiral, Mr. Mauney was a career submarine officer, having served at sea on 4 submarines, including command of the nuclear-powered submarine USS L. Mendel Rivers. Many other important command and staff assignments was enduring freedom and Iraqi freedom, directing naval air, surface ship, and submarine operations, conducting strategic and financial planning for the U.S. Navy. Most recently, and probably one of the most important assignments, was a deputy commander of U.S. Strategic Command. In this role, he directed military forces in the conduct of assigned missions, including strategic deterrence, space, and cyberspace operations, and advocated for required multi-service military capabilities to support present and future operations. Mr. Mauney holds a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from some university called Georgia something. I can't read it here. Georgia Tech. And an MBA from Chamonix University. He was a fellow executive fellow at the U.S. Department of State. He's completed the Navy Executive Business Course at the University of North Carolina, Keegan Flagg Business School at Chapel Hill. Please welcome Mr. Mauney. He'll be speaking on the nuclear security and operations perspective.
It is really a pleasure to be here today. I actually enjoy speaking to groups such as yourself, and it's been a while, but I'll try to be a little bit entertaining and also tell some stories, some sea stories, some land stories, but some hopefully that you'll find some sense of connection to the real question of what the Institute concerns itself with, which is about nuclear security. And having read last year's annual report, there's a very broad spectrum that you get in the interest area in the Interest Institute. So what I say today is my personal experiences for the most part. I have a bit about Y-12 and the Institute, but I'm not speaking for the Y-12 or the U.S. government. I want to thank Howard Hall. I know Howard's up in the board meeting, but I do want to thank him for inviting me, and also the INS and the Baker Center team. I've been a fan of this center for a long time. As you know, some say that long speeches are boring and tiresome, and that important things ought to be said succinctly. There's a couple of examples. Gettysburg Address, 272 words. The Ten Commandments, 297 words. The United States Declaration of Independence, 300 words. Mine weighs in just under 4,000 words, so I'll try to I'm going to try to give you a perspective on some things I saw over the years in the Navy. I'll be unabashedly a fan of the United States Navy, and so I'll give you some perspective on that. It is a great organization, as are all of our military services. My outline will include a background, a little bit on my service, discussion on approaches to nuclear security in some of our government. Just say some, I'm not going to talk about all of it. I'm going to link a couple of 3 areas together. I'll talk a little bit about strategic command, which is a fascinating place and for a lot of reasons, and hopefully I can convince you of that. And then I'll close with a little short Y-12 and INS focus. I've been, as Joe said, I've been at Y-12 for 2 years, and as Vice President for Program Management. Joe didn't mention, Joe's on the team, and I am grateful for those team members who are here today. I am grateful for what they and their the other patriots at Y-12 do every day. It is a great team. Let me go to the first picture. That's me. I'm in a helicopter, actually a Navy helicopter, and I'm flying from the USS Mount Whitney, which is the U.S. 6th Fleet Command ship, which stays in the Mediterranean most of the time. I'm heading back to the airport in Naples. I was assigned there for a couple of years, and I'll use the word team a lot, but the 6th Fleet team is a great team. It is the 6th Fleet's been in Naples around Naples, up the coast in Gaeta, Italy, for many years, since the end of World War II. And it has been a guardian of peace in that part of the world, and that's an interesting part of the world. Thinking about it from the NATO perspective, Italy is a member of NATO, the United States is a member of NATO. The North Africa continent is just down the road. There is a tremendous flow of, I'll just say, non-citizen people up into Southern Europe. And so there are, along with the terrorist issues that are going on in Africa. So just a very interesting and active area for defense. Another interesting area. This is the DMZ in Korea. This is, you'll look, I'll try to point it out. Look at this piece of concrete right here. That is the border between North and South Korea. You are looking, I took this picture about 3 or 4 years ago, so this is not dated. You go to this place at Panmunjom, it's like going back in time, about 60 years. These are South Korean Marines, actually, and these are North Korean soldiers. That's a group of North Korean citizens who toured these 2 buildings here. These 2 buildings are where the armistice was negotiated and signed in 1953. Meetings are still held periodically here between the 2 nations, North and South Korea. And it's just an interesting place. And this shows you that points of friction between nations exist. And that also nations will act in their own interest. And you see that from North and South Korea regularly, and you have over the years. And so I don't have to tell you all of the different things. You can recite them. The list is a mile long. So just an interesting country. Let me see if I can flash it. Now, it's going pretty fast. I'll keep talking. The next picture is next picture, I'll show you, is a North Korean soldier. I went into one of those buildings, and each side, North Korea and South Korea / the United States, alternates possession of that building. So when the South has possession of the building, the North is out of the building, and you can actually go into North Korea in one end of the building. And the North Korean soldiers on that end stand at the windows and look in, so they're able to see what you're doing in the building. Starting windows. Well, that's not a good sign. But the uniform is interesting as well as the face, the facial expressions. It's a game face, serious. Okay, so this is a place where there's no humor. I mean, this is national interest at stake every minute of the day, and these young soldiers on both sides represent their nations and have to maintain the peace at this site. So this, oh, we're losing power.
Did I cut it
goes
off?
back there. It says still starting Windows. I really want to get through these pictures.
And do they speak the same language, the South and the North?
Yes.
So
Their
they
dialects.
could eavesdrop or spy? I mean, do they
Yes.
try to spy?
Yes. I'll give you an example.
Why don't you assist?
Recent examples, not recent, last 10 years or so, a North Korean submarine beached on the east coast of South Korea. And it had apparently infiltrated a number of folks in South Korea. Periodically, although not lately, the South Koreans have uncovered the ends of tunnels that are dug under the DMZ miles into South Korea. And they're big enough for two people. I've actually been down in one of these tunnels as part of this tour. And they're actually wide enough for two people to walk shoulder to shoulder, so they're not like a small tunnel you can crawl through. Now, you know, the South does their best. I'm not sure who this is. Oh, she's calling on the phone. And I don't want to overdrive on South Korea. Let me see the next picture. Next picture will be a USO troop. I worked for General Tommy Franks as his senior military assistant for 3 years, from before 9/11, 2001, until the day he retired. So wherever he was, I was usually within about 10 feet, and I had a string of folks that we helped him to execute his mission. So the picture here was taken on one of he is a big fan of the USO. Who does not know in this room who the USO is? And it's not a criticism. USO is an organization. I saw it almost go up over there. The USO is an organization chartered by the Congress. It's kind of like a non-government organization, and its purpose is to support the U.S. military, men and women. And they're famous for, Bob Hope. You remember Bob Hope? The USO troops that shows that he used to host in Vietnam. You may have seen those in some old movies. I doubt many of you were old enough to be alive in Vietnam. But these days, and if I can get this picture going, General Franks was a huge fan of making sure that these people, the celebrities, sports figures, you name it, got into where the troops were. The picture I'm going to show you is in the back of a C-130 airplane, which is an Air Force aircraft that was en route to Baghdad International Airport in 2003, late May. So this is right after the end of, I'll call, and I don't want to get into political dialogue here, but the end of major combat operations. And so who you'll see are a bunch of Hollywood folks, except for one. But the USO takes in Hollywood celebrities. They take in musicians. I went into with another USO group into Kandahar in Afghanistan in December of 2001, into the airport in Kandahar, and it was a country western group, and they played for the Marines who'd only taken that airport 3 days before. So these USO troops go where it's hot. They go in and they make sure our troops get some diversion. Okay, so that's a good thing. It's coming up. I'll be in trouble if I have to find the DVD. Oh, there it is. There we go. All right. There's a soldier I told you about. Game face. Okay, I was out of order here. This is General Franks. These are Marines. This is in Kabul, Afghanistan, December the 1st, 2001. Pretty early, right? Okay, December the 1st, 2001. He's talking to the Marines. This is it's a Marine platoon. And they're on the grounds of the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. The U.S. Embassy had been in Kabul since the 1980s. When we walked away from it in 1989, when the revolution and the war in Afghanistan reached a certain peak pitch of intensity, we evacuated that embassy and just left it. An Afghan family moved into that embassy and took care of it. But China was still in the cabinets when we walked back into it in November of 2001. And so the Marines were there to guard the ambassador and his staff against a pretty fractious environment. And so just a salute to the Marines and a demonstration of leadership. General Franks spent easily half his time talking to troops, sailors, airmen, Marines, whoever he was around, really find out what they were thinking, what their needs were, and were their needs being met so that they could accomplish their mission. This is the USO troop. Robert De Niro, and I'll point out Gary Sinise down there in the green shirt. These people went into Baghdad. The temperature was over 100 degrees on the tarmac, and they signed autographs for hours and just talked to the troops. So I'm not saying these are better than anybody else. This is just an example of some great Americans. This is another group of great Americans, and this is, I'm going to make a couple of points on this one. The gentleman in the blue shirt there, that's Kevin Chilton. He is was a four-star general in the Air Force at the time, commander of U.S. Strategic Command, and a former astronaut, space shuttle pilot. This is the STRATCOM staff, and we're all a bunch of old guys, except for this guy right here. He talked us into becoming road bikers. And so at the age of 57, I bought myself a road bike. I lost 35 pounds in the first 3 months. I carried that weight for 30 years. And I kept most of it off. I'll gain a little bit back. We just finished a fundraising bike ride for this fire station, which is out north of Omaha in Nebraska. And one of my lessons late in life, I was always pretty active, and if you'd asked me, I said, yeah, I work out 2 or 3 times a week. The truth was, 1 time every other week, probably. I work out 4 to 5 times a week now, every week, and I'm still riding my road bike. And there's a bunch of folks that I ride with out in Oak Ridge or down in South Knoxville. So the lesson to you folks, you young folks, is make fitness part of your life, make nutrition part of your life, and work-life balance part of your life. That's a submarine. That's the USS San Juan. It is exiting the Thames River, not to be confused with the Thames River in London, it's spelled the same. It's in Connecticut. That's the New London Ledge Light. There's a submarine base up that river. San Juan is just an example of one of the 48 or so attack submarines that we have. This is the front end up here. That's the rudder. You're only looking at about 1/3 of the submarine. Okay, I think I've got
How many
you.
people does that hold?
About 130. The larger submarines that carry the ballistic missiles, named after the USS Ohio, which is the lead ship of the class, they carry about 150. So they're a lot bigger. About 360 feet long. This part's 33 feet in diameter, and can dive down greater than 800 feet and go faster than 30 knots. And a knot is a little more than a mile an hour. Okay, 35 years in the Navy. I'll talk a little bit about the Navy. The Navy has tribes, and I use tribes as a term of endearment. Their tribes are groups of people, and I would say the different schools at UT are tribes. They're like tribes. They have different cultures, different ways of thinking of things. They know different things. The 3 main tribes in the Navy are surface, aviation, and submarines. I was part of the submarine group. We do a lot of stuff together, and I'm not to say that we don't operate together, because we do constantly, but the training is kind of separate. Your upbringing, your initial training is separate, and so you kind of get inculcated with your own culture. The aviators are the guys that drive those pointy nose aircraft at 600 or 700 knots and do all that dangerous stuff, live on the edge, Top Gun, and they deserve every amount of credit that they get, and they do some wonderful work. Surface ships, same, and then the submarine team, obviously, I'm biased about that one. Today's Navy is out and about doing what we do, what they do. I don't do it anymore, but what they are doing. There are 97 ships and submarines forward deployed today, out of 286 ships and submarines in the battle force. So that's about 37%. That means overseas, Indian Ocean, Pacific, Atlantic, Western Oceans, that sort of thing. Another 40 ships and submarines are operating in home waters conducting training. The Navy is just one of 5 military services. You're probably scratching your head, who's number 5? Well, that's our U.S. Coast Guard. Navy and the Coast Guard are both very close. If you don't know much about the Coast Guard is one of, I think it is a great service. They always have been. They have a wonderful tradition and a very professional force. And they operate not only in U.S. waters, but they're overseas doing things as well. But all the services are great in their own right. And we team together, all the services team together regularly. And they're out there defending you.
Why do you need submarines?
Why do we need submarines? Well, if I have about 4 hours, I can tell. The submarine, now I'll tell you what our submarine missions are in a minute, maybe that'll tell. But they fill a role that requires stealth, requires operating out of sight. I'll give you an example. When you're around other navies and you're a surface ship, they operate in a certain way. When you're not around them, they operate in different ways because they think they're not being watched. Well, the submarine can actually watch what they're doing and not be seen. So you get to see some of the real things those navies are capable of doing. Does that make sense? Yeah. Let's see. 20 moves. 35 years. I moved my family 20 times. That's every 18 months to 2.5 years. I have a wonderful spouse who's been with me the whole time, almost the whole time. I got married after a couple of years, but I have three great daughters. They are independent, and they stand on their own feet. I think that's in no small part to having to move around. They are a little bit special. They're triplets, and so they all came at once, and we had a lot of excitement until they went off to college. But I'm very proud of them. Our military families are truly important, what our military does. They don't get credit. I know the President and Mrs. Obama give them a lot of credit and a lot of attention, and I think that's great. The military families are really important to our national security and my view. I'm amazed at the Americans, and when I'm asked what was the best thing about your military service, it's the young Americans who keep standing up, raising their right hand, taking the oath, and serving in the military. When you get to watch them in action, they water your eyes. They really are that good. And I'm just continuously amazed that they keep coming forward from all walks of life around the country. So you all ought to be very proud of them and tell them that. As an officer, my job was to, first of all, take care of my sailors. Second of all, be ready to conduct missions that the submarine I was assigned to was given, and then make sure that the sailors had everything they needed. Because the engine of success are those soldiers, the sailors, the airmen, and the Marines who do the work every day. As Joe mentioned, I went to Georgia Tech, and let me take a minute. I went through an ROTC scholarship. I'm grateful for that. probably wouldn't have gone to college if it wasn't for that. Went into submarines and why to go in submarines? Well, my dad took me to visit one when I was 12. It kind of stuck in my mind, and that's kind of where I was. Let me give you a couple of things if you want to try to get an idea of what it's like to live in a submarine. Load your freezer, get one of those freeze boxes, load it to the brim with frozen food in the order that you want to eat it, and then start at the top, and that's all you eat for 2 weeks. You just eat your way down through that freezer. That's kind of the food situation on submarines. Another way to get an idea of what a submarine's like, go down into the utility area in your basement. You know, it's dark down there, there's a heater, there's a lot of pipes, there's wires. Set yourself up a coffee pot. Make a cup of coffee, or make a pot of coffee, and then do that for weeks. Never wash your cup, never wash the pot. Add a little coffee to the grounds every now and then. That's a cup of U.S. Navy engine room coffee. Seriously, a unique environment, but a very special team that's out there doing that. My first submarine, USS Tunney, in those days they were all named after fish. These days they're named after states and cities for the most part. A few are named after American patriots. The ship I commanded, Mineral Rivers, was named after a congressman from South Carolina back in the 70s. He was on the House Armed Services Committee, and he was a friend of the Admiral that was running the nuclear Navy, Admiral Rickover. So Admiral Rickover honored him by naming the submarine after him. The reason we changed, and I don't know if this is true or not, but Admiral Rickover was alleged to have said at one point along the way, fish don't vote. So we started naming them after states. But I'll tell you, the citizens of the cities for which these submarines are named often have wonderful relationships of support with the crews on those submarines. So whereas before we didn't have that, it really didn't, and I'll point to a couple. USS Chicago is no longer in commission, but the 721 Club in Chicago still exists, and they still support the Navy and submarines. There are other examples out there, great city relationships where either the mayor or the city council or some civic group stands up, pulls out their hand, and out in Nebraska, the state of Nebraska, USS Nebraska has been commissioned for years, but the committee that stood up to help commission the submarine and acknowledge the linkage with the state still brings sailors back every year from the USS Nebraska to Nebraska. They take them all over the state. It's just a really important relationship. So.
Could you get a submarine in Oxford?
Probably not.
Well, it's navigable.
When we commissioned the USS Louisiana when I was in the Navy, the state actually asked the Navy to bring the submarine up the Mississippi River 90 miles, and we did not do that. Mainly because when you commission a submarine, the crew is very new, and they're not very experienced at navigation and difficult. And that 90-mile trip up that river would have been a very tough challenge for the crew. And there's other reasons. I mean, they have to drive all the way across the Gulf of Mexico. It's just a lot of issues, but the state took it with great grace. We had the commissioning over in Kings Bay, Georgia, and it was a great story. But we try to be thoughtful about where we take the submarine, especially the nuclear submarine. That's all we have. Let's see. I was on 4 attack submarines. Their mission is remaining hidden, operating, collecting intelligence, visibly showing the flag when necessary, working with other navies, a very active relationship working with all these other navies. One story, in 1986, I was assigned to USS Los Angeles. We were out in the Western Pacific, which means South China Sea, Sea of Japan, down near the Philippines. We actually happened to be up in the South China Sea, and we were asked to go join a U.S. aircraft carrier group and participate in a demonstration of the U.S. Navy's capabilities. And so we went up there and came up submerged and got the our instructions, and our instructions were to surface between the aircraft carrier and then the line of surface ships. So about 600 yards or 2 football field lengths off the carrier. So we had to come up from deep, and you can't see where you're going. So you got to you got to plan it, you got to know where everybody is, and everybody's got to know you're coming up. So we surfaced right in the middle, and that all went fine. I found out later there were a group of Chinese People's Liberation Army leadership on the aircraft carrier. It was a very early exchange of demonstrations with the Chinese, 1986. So that's pretty far back. And then we submerged and we headed off because the next part of the demonstration was a bunch of Navy aircraft dropping 500-pound bombs in the water. We really didn't want to be around for that. Ballistic missile submarines are the other type we have. They carry the intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Ohio class are the ones at sea today. We started off with 41. They were called 41 for Freedom back in the George Washington was the very first one back in 1960. And continuously since that time, we've had either a large number during the Cold War at sea or a small number today, providing deterrence for our country. So their mission is to remain undetected and sail the oceans and be ready for the call that hopefully will never come. But that's what they do. Of note, all the submarines, like me, have retired. The ones that I was ever on. So they only have a certain amount of life. Some say the Cold War was a much easier time. We just had one country that was causing us challenges. I think that's probably, from my perspective, not completely accurate. I think every time has its set of challenges. If any of you have read the book John Adams, written by McCullough, talks about the time period in John Adams' life, starting before the revolution and ending up after his term as a president, and after that up to his death. The birth of a country is never a good time. It's never a comfortable time, and that time is a great example of that. Lots of churn, lots of division, lots of political. So if you look at our Congress today and think it's fractious, I mean, you could argue it was equally, if not more, fractious back in those days. And I would guess another example would be Abraham Lincoln, if you've seen the movie about his working with his Congress, trying to get bills through the Congress. And so our form of government is challenging. It always has been. I think it always will be. And we as citizens need to make sure we're doing our part to make sure they've got our perspective. But what went on in the Cold War was a result of World War II and then afterwards. Before World War II, and there's several good books that talk about nuclear technology. Radioactivity was known long before the war. Radioactive materials. The physicists around the world, and they all exchanged notes and mail, and they sent each other their thesis. Germany, Japan, the United States, you just name it, France, the UK, they all knew about nuclear fission. And they'd all kind of concluded, yeah, you could make a bomb. And so when the war started, the game changed, and you all know the story there. But I think it's safe to say nuclear technology is here to stay, and in all its various forms. I would guess there's nuclear technology on this campus in the form of X-ray machines, if for nothing else. So that's the context that we've all inherited. The Cold War was an interesting time. My first 2 years on my first submarine, 1976 and 77, you add the days at sea up, it's almost 600 days I spent at sea. And that's a demand. And that was kind of typical for the submarine. We were in high demand. We had Army troops in Germany. They were in high demand. We had aircraft stationed around the world. It was just an interesting time. The end of Vietnam was not too far back, 3 or 4 years prior to that. When we traveled around the country in those days, in the military, we almost never wore a uniform. In fact, we never did. I never. And I would have been really surprised to hear what I've heard in the last few years. Someone in an airport thanking me for my service, or thanking a soldier. And I think it is absolutely marvelous that the citizens of the United States do that today regularly. You've probably seen a YouTube video of some soldiers going through an airport down at the baggage claim area where people show appreciation for this group of soldiers by giving them a round of applause. I've seen that in Atlanta Airport. Your soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines and Coast Guardsmen today really appreciate that kind of support. And the fact that the citizens of the U.S., most of them, can separate the political decisions our leaders make from the service our youngsters provide is, I think, a maturing process that is just really great. So thanks for those of you who do that. Joe mentioned the State Department Fellowship. I spent a year with some wonderful diplomats and came away from that. Although the Navy being out and about most of the time, going to foreign countries, has a tradition of interacting with our embassies overseas, I really have a wonderful appreciation for our diplomats at the State Department and what they do for our country. They really are unsung heroes. And that's not just the ambassador, but that's all the staffs and everybody. I was Chief of Staff of the Navy headquarters in Bahrain. That's in the Middle East. Bahrain is connected by a causeway to Saudi Arabia, and it's an island other than that. Arab culture, Muslim culture, tremendous growth experience, but also strategic location in the Middle East, and had been there for a long time. I was promoted to Rear Admiral in 2005 or so, and then I was assigned to a job in Italy. You saw one of the pictures. The job, I had multiple hats. That's what you say in the Navy when you have when you're real busy. You got different jobs. You wear multiple hats. You just swap your hat. I had a job as a commander of NATO submarines, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Some say no action talk only. I think NATO is an absolutely essential ingredient to the modern security environment. That's me. 28 nations who all have to agree to speak together. And so when NATO says something, that means all of them agree. It is not a democratic group. One nation can derail an initiative, but they still get a lot done. An example is, after we'd been in Afghanistan for a year or so, we were looking around for somebody to kind of help us out and take over some of those ground operations in Afghanistan. NATO didn't bat an eye. They stood forward, sent a Turkish two-star commander to Afghanistan, set up headquarters, and that headquarters is still there today. So, NATO, a good group. Anyway, I had an opportunity to get 5 NATO submarines together in Ceuta Bay, not in Ceuta Bay, but in Sigonella, Sicily, off Italy, for an exercise. That's some training. And so I had to go down and meet with all their skippers. We had some discussions, and then I went to all 5 boats. They were all tied up in this little pier area. So I started off on I got to get this right. I started off on a Turkish submarine and had a cup of Turkish coffee. I went next door to a Greek submarine, had a cup of Greek coffee. I went next door to another Turk submarine for another cup of Turkish coffee. Anybody had Turkish coffee? It's pretty strong. It's about as strong as Greek coffee. The next one was an Italian submarine for a cappuccino. Followed up finally by a Norwegian submarine. So those are nations who thought it was important enough to contribute their precious resources, their young sailors, their submarines, to come down to the Mediterranean and work together. So that demonstration keeps going today. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. I was appointed and confirmed by the U.S. Senate as a Vice Admiral in 2007. Went out to STRATCOM. And I'll talk about STRATCOM in a minute, but I want to start the next dialogue. I'm going to talk about State Department, a little bit about Department of Energy and Department of Defense. There is a scene at the heart of the military, and I'll talk about that scene. But that scene is this military person in uniform. The next person above him is a civilian. And that civilian-military scene, or demarcation point for decision-making, is a feature of our nation. It is somewhat unique, but it's becoming more prevalent around the world. In that the military decisions start up at the civilian level, and they permeate downward. As I mentioned, I worked for General Franks. We went for almost 3 years. We were in the Middle East every month for 10 or 12 days for almost 3 years. A large part of the other time was in Washington, D.C., briefing either the Secretary of Defense or General Franks was over in the White House briefing the President and the National Security Team about what our upcoming operations would be. That's where the decisions get made. The selection of operations, and this is not a secret, it's just something that's good to think about, that navigating that scene is one of the challenges that both our military and civilians in our government have to do every day. And so I'll give you some examples of some of the great people who are working to try to do that and really leaning toward the nuclear security area. Only got 2 more hours. So. Department of State. Most of this I'm going to talk about comes from the public website, a little bit of personal anecdotes in here. But as I mentioned, I place our diplomats and their supporting teams in the embassies on equal footing with our military for being true patriots and heroes. I went to Yemen one time with General Franks on a visit with the leadership of the country of Yemen. And Yemen is a nation that a few years before had a terrorist group attack the USS Colon. So it is a pretty fractious place. There have been civil wars in Yemen over the years. The President, Ali Abdel Saleh at the time, understood what America was about, understood why it was important to have a relationship. So we would go visit him periodically, and the ambassador there, her name was Barbara Bodine, and a few days before we got there, she had actually been on an airliner flying from one place to another, and the airliner had been hijacked by terrorists. Ultimately, she was released and ended up coming back to Yemen. But that's the kinds of things our diplomats face from time to time, is that danger, that difficulty. Diplomacy can be challenging, it can be pleasant. It spans a spectrum, but it's essential to our nation. Acting Under Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security is the Honorable Rose Gottmuller. I met Rose out at STRATCOM. Rose was appointed to lead our negotiations with the Russians for the New START Treaty. Rose has an extensive background. I'm using her first name. I know her reasonably well. I don't know her personally. But if you were to meet her, she's just as down-to-earth and personal, in my view, as you can imagine. But she's quite bright and a great negotiator, as we now know, because we have a New START Treaty that was agreed to by both Russians and our governments. And it is in the implementation phase. And it's a good treaty. There are different arguments about the treaty, but Rose's present job, she's responsible for nonproliferation, arms control, regional security, defense relations, arms transfer, security assistance. Rose had a tour at the Department of Energy. Her title there was Deputy Undersecretary of Energy for Defense Non-Nuclear Proliferation. So she's been in the nuclear security business pretty much her whole life. The New START Treaty, STRATCOM, before the treaty was even negotiated, had spent a couple of years doing some studies, analysis, looking at the mission, what national command authority direction had been provided for the deterrence mission, and using both in-house resources as well as external resources, strategic study groups, and so on. And so Ms. Gottmuller came to STRATCOM. We briefed her on our mission, gave her some background into the nuclear forces, the Navy and the Air Force, principally, pretty much all. And then we maintained an informal liaison with the negotiation team throughout the negotiations on the treaty. Occasionally we get a technical question where, hey, if you need to go do some sort of verification means, can you do X? And we go back and say, no, we can't do X, or we can do Y. And so help the team to be able to, each time they met with the Russians, to have a proposal or a counter proposal that would try to reach a consensus between the two parties. So I think really important role. Occasionally General Chilton, that biker in the blue suit, would be asked formally for his views on certain things. And that was, of course, he engaged the staff, and we try to support it. There are 3 bureaus under Ms. Gott-Mueller: Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance; the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. The State Department calls everything the Bureau, not everything, but most things. And the last one is the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation. So you can see that she's occupied most of her time with these kinds of issues. I guess I can move forward a little bit. That was my one Department of State picture. Department of Energy. Again, publicly available internet information. Reading through their websites, DOE appears to apply a broad focus to nuclear security. But I'm going to focus, for time's sake, on the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is the organization that has the NW Y-12 under contract, managing and operating the Y-12 site. NSA, their mission is to ensure the nation sustains a safe and secure and effective nuclear deterrent through the application of science, technology, engineering, and manufacturing. They also provide a safe, secure, reliable nuclear weapons stockpile. They partner with the Department of Defense to provide an effective deterrent for the nation. So, again, the word partnership directly linked to DOD, but also Department of State is a strong linkage with DOE. So, the picture I'm setting up is there's a lot of interaction at the working level and at the senior level in these 3 departments on this area that we're talking about. The 3 missions, I've already mentioned the first, managing the nuclear weapons stockpile. The second mission area for NNSA that I'll mention is, and this is not all of their missions, this is just 3. Preventing proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or keeping WMD out of the hands of state and non-state actors. And then their third mission is countering nuclear terrorism, making the globe more safe. So again, all these mission areas dovetail in with the State Department, and as you'll see in a minute, DOD. Okay, I'll talk about this map in a minute, who these guys are. But Department of Defense, the mission that I'm going to focus on in DOD, and DOD has a very wide variety of missions, is what's called Combating Weapons of Mass Destruction, CWMD. In the Office of Secretary of Defense, and that relates directly to nuclear security, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and that's kind of a euphemism for the civilian group that runs DOD. It's called the Office of the Secretary of Defense. There are a number of key leaders interested in nuclear security that I'm going to mention too. The Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs, the Honorable Madeline Creedon. Some of you may know the Honorable Madeline Creedon. She was the Chief Counsel to the Senate Committee on Appropriations, and she was a tough customer. In my submarine career, I had, and at STRATCOM, I was asked to go and brief her on our program several times. She's extremely sharp and made the jump to government service from, I'll say, the executive branch from the Congress, and now is providing great leadership in global strategic affairs. What does she do? She develops policy for the Secretary on countering weapons of mass destruction, policy on nuclear forces and missile defense, cybersecurity, and space issues. That's pretty easy to do, right? Space, cyber, nuclear. Okay, she's got a big portfolio. The other position, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, Biological Defense Programs, the Honorable Andrew Weber. I had regular interactions with Andrew Weber at STRATCOM, a number of working groups to include the START Treaty interactions between the Pentagon and STRATCOM, as well as just nuclear issues in general that come up on a pretty regular basis to try to review. Okay. I've kind of described some of the civilian level. Now we'll move down below that line we talked about earlier to the military level. That's what these things are. Combatant commands. They're their emblems over there. The top 6 are geographic. You can see where their areas of responsibility are. I worked for General Franks, and this was his, U.S. Central Command. I mean, nothing goes on there, right? Central Asia, Middle East, East Africa, Egypt, and so really, and Iran is in that area, as is Syria. Interesting set of areas. But all of these are interesting. Northern Command, European Command, Russia. That's a big customer. The combatant commands are staffed by military and civilians. And the military is all the services, all 5. There's very few Coast Guard, mostly Navy, Air Force, Army, and Marines. And the flavors are different. If you go to CENTCOM, it's mostly Army. If you go to PACOM, commanded by a Navy Admiral, it's mostly Navy. So I say mostly. The staff is higher percentage of Navy. It's not more than half, but it's higher percentage. And it really depends on the mission. SOUTHCOM kind of has more of a ground focus, so it would have Army and Marines. Northern Command, and this one's a little different, it's a lot Air Force. And it was formed after 9/11 from what used to be called U.S. Space Command. And so you can imagine a combatant command named Space Command would be mostly Air Force. So it suffices to say, I'll use the tribe term, but these commands have to support each other. These lines of difference here, those are seams, and they have to be seamless. These groups have to work together. That's just all there is to it. In fact, if you think about operations in Afghanistan, which is about right there, PACOM has an interest because stuff goes this way. UCOM has an interest because supplies come in this way. Northern Command, which operates things like missile defense. But Northern Command also works with the services on logistics. This group down here, they're not geographic, they're functional. Special Operations Command. Okay? So that's kind of an obvious one. This is Special Operations. Army Special Forces, Navy Special Forces, Marine Special Forces. They do some of the sneaky work that needs to be done around the world. Transportation Command. Again, that's an obvious one. In the military, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be moved. 90% of the men, materials, equipment that went to Iraq went by sea, by ship. The rest of it went by Air Force air. All of that was done by Transportation Command. So the services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, they plug into Transportation Command and they supply all of the materials that need to go somewhere to conduct a military operation. STRATCOM. STRATCOM has 8, when I was there, had 8 mission areas, and I'll talk to them about in a minute. So where do the services fit? If these are the guys that actually do the operations, where does the Army and the Navy fit? Well, they're called the force providers. They bring people in, recruit, train them, give them their basic training, train them in a skill, prepare them, organize them into units, and then those units are turned over to these commanders for military operations. And usually those service forces are under the command of an intermediate service commander. For example, I told you I was stationed in Bahrain, which is right there, in the Middle East, in the Navy Command. My boss was a 3-star admiral. He's the one that actually operated all the naval forces in this area for that 4-star General Franks at Central Command. So he worked for an Army guy. that's the way our military is organized today. And it's been that way since the late 80s, and I think it's a good one. I mentioned General Chilton as our boss. He was just one member of a wonderful team of all the militaries there. The first mission that I'll mention at STRATCOM is commanding and controlling the nuclear forces, day-to-day posture, making sure they were ready if needed. Submarines at sea, ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles that are out in the Midwest. You've probably read about a few of them in the paper recently. The Air Force operates those, and then if bombers are needed, then they can be put into play. Our force is dramatically smaller today than it was in the Cold War, about 1/10 the size, much smaller, and it operates differently in terms of, I'll call it the distance to danger. In other words, there's a wider margin established today intentionally, both by us and others who have these forces, to keep the safety element as strong as possible. Another mission was STRATCOM was responsible for operating all of the military space systems and satellites. We did that using our Air Force component, and that's something that goes. How many people have GPS on your phone? Okay. STRATCOM is responsible for making sure that the GPS satellite system of about 30 plus satellites is working every day. They do that through I'll just use an example. There's a 19-year-old airman out in the Colorado Springs area who sits at a computer, and he operates those satellites. He sends signals up and down. He charges their batteries using solar energy cells when they need to be charged. So that's all done through Strategic Command. And all of the other military, now there's lots of non-military space systems, but for the military-owned ones, that's what's STRATCOM. One of the other missions I'll mention in space, there's over 1,100 active satellites orbiting the Earth. There's over 20,000 pieces of space debris orbiting the Earth. Those wonderful airmen out there around the world operate a tracking system that tracks the satellites and the debris and works with the 60-plus owner-operators of satellite systems around the world to make sure the satellites are moved if a piece of debris looks like it's going to come close. Every now and then you'll hear you'll read in the media about the International Space Station being boosted up a little bit. It's got little rockets on it. And that's generally to increase the distance to a piece of space debris. Sometimes you'll hear them going into they have an emergency escape capsule there, a Soyuz capsule that's connected to the International Space Station. Sometimes you'll actually hear of the inhabitants of the space station actually going into that satellite, shut the door. That means there's one that maybe they can't move, and there's a variety of reasons for that. So STRATCOM helps make sure that continues to happen. And so that's a really important function.
Where does NASA fit in?
NASA is an advisor in this effort, but they don't really have a role in it. I mean, we exchange information with NASA, but this operation is run out of the Secretary of Defense's office. One of those two people that I mentioned earlier is in charge.
Suppose the Secretary of Defense says, I need a new device at X. Wouldn't they turn that over to NASA?
The Air Force would generally
They develop it?
They might collaborate with NASA. The U.S. military uses the Wallops Island and Cape Canaveral facilities to launch, but sometimes they use military launch facilities, and sometimes they'll use the commercial facilities. So it just depends on what the payload is and where it needs to go. If it's going up to geosynchronous orbit, which is 22,000 miles up, that takes a lot of energy to get up there. It's a bigger rocket. If it's just going into low Earth orbit or a polar orbit, then that's a different story. But NASA's, I mean, you know what their mission is. I mean, it's what the president has put in training in terms of, the interplanetary exploration that they're looking at, and trip to the moon. So I'm really not an expert on NASA, and I'll defer to NASA for exactly what their mission is. Another main mission was operation and defense of the DoD cyber networks. Just think about that. Where is the Department of Defense? Where's your military? They're all over the place. Not literally, but they're around the world. DoD has computer networks either owned or leased in 80 countries. And so Stratcom, imagine having that job to oversee the operation of that type of a network and the defense of that type of network. So, interesting problem. That mission has been turned over to a new command called U.S. Cyber Command, which was stood up about 3 years ago. And so Stratcom kind of monitors that mission, but they no longer do that. Okay, one other mission Stratcom has, and I'll try to wind this up. We talked about combating weapons of mass destruction. Stratcom has a mission called synchronization of the activities in that area. Every one of these regional commanders have that mission, not to synchronize, but to conduct operations to prevent proliferation. If proliferation happens and the U.S. military is called in to do something about it, say we're in a country somewhere, country X, and we come across an abandoned enrichment plant for uranium. That'd be unusual, I'm just making that up. The DoD has the capability to go into that plant and characterize it and clean it up, contain it, and remove it from the proliferation area. In other words, if there were materials in there that were of interest to a proliferant, you'd want those to be kind of corralled in and sent to a place that in the U.S. or in another country that would safeguard and prevent that from being captured by somebody. So these commanders, not all of them have it. The Army actually has the capabilities, but these commanders can all draw on that. Stratcom's job was to work with all of these different commanders, find out what their needs are, and make sure the department was funding those needs in either the next budget or the one after that. We held a synchronization conference every year while I was at Stratcom, where we brought all of these folks together, all of the civilian organizations I talked about earlier, and we sat down for a couple of days and we talked about this mission, and we talked about what is it we need to do to make sure when the time comes we can act in an integrated, effective fashion. And so some planning was done. We put together a website so that all of the different participants could list what actual capabilities they had in their kit bag that could be applied to the various problems. And there's a bunch of different kinds of problems that you might want to be able to solve when you think about materials that could be used by a person you'd not like to see use them to build some weapon of mass destruction. So this goes on all the time. It continues. I mean, I don't have any real-time information, but periodically you read about it in papers. And this is really an area that I think our country, and that's why I appreciate the Institute of Nuclear Security and their interest here at UT. This is something that's going to continue to evolve, and it's going to take bright minds and thinkers and people who have a vast array of experience to really keep our nation on the best possible footing. Okay, let's see what I got next.
Have you followed closely Syria?
I read the same paper you do. It is really an area of concern.
But there's a real example of taking care of proliferation and reducing it. It's not
Absolutely.
nuclear, but it's weapons, it's biological and chemical weapons.
I mean, and we've already seen the effects of chemical weapons usage.
Yeah.
And it's just, it is an area where our nation needs to be paying attention. I mean, this is, I think, obvious, and we are. I don't know if I would not, but I'm glad to see this kind of effort contributing to that awareness, building capabilities for the future. That's a Y-12 chart. And that's some of the things we do at Y-12 in this area. Nuclear nonproliferation and global security programs. Joe read, that's one of the programs in our portfolio. Steve Sanders is here. Steve's back here. He's in charge of this area, and he and his team do a great job. We manage high-impact work. We use science and engineering skills. We've got one of our engineers here, Megan over here. We use our science and engineering skills to help in this area. These are some of the core competencies we use at Y-12. Physical security, material control and accountability, uranium processing, chemistry, metallurgy, those are all resident at Y-12 in our workforce, and they're core capabilities. Educating and training first responders. I've mentioned already a radiological source and an X-ray machine that's probably here on the campus. We do training a couple times a month at Y-12 of first responders, fire department, police department, hospital staffs, all around the country. They come to Y-12. We have a training program where we teach them about the material, and then we send them on their way with some suggestions on how to really make sure they're taking the best care of these things that they can. There's some other organizations we occasionally get asked to work with as well. Last couple of points here, not so much nuclear security, although one in the middle there, TerraPower. TerraPower is a company formed to build a fourth generation reactor. It's a commercial initiative that we are collaborating with a whole wide variety of folks, including the TerraPower company, universities around the country, various places and our role obviously is in the fuel area for this reactor in terms of its design. This is a very early R&D project. We're working with NASA and the Los Alamos National Laboratory on some research that might someday deliver a new space reactor for spacecraft. And then Ashley Stowe, one of our great PhDs, got an R&D 100 award for a nuclear detection invention. Anybody recognize that picture? Yeah. We have an active collaboration with you folks, and we're grateful for it. Dr. Cheek and I argue about who gets the most benefit, UT or Y-12. I think it's equal, if not. But we appreciate the active collaboration with Howard and Taylor Ivey and just the whole team. Debbie Reed here from Y-12 is a key ingredient in putting all this together. But this active collaboration is just really important, I think, to both institutions, and we aim to see that it stays as rich as it is. Finally, the INS. We've talked across most of those pillars today, and I'm not going to go any further other than to say again, a great group of collaborators here on the right, and we look forward to more collaboration in the future. Okay, thanks for your attention. I want to close out and back to the point I said about our men and women in uniform. They really are good, and they deserve our appreciation. So if you see a soldier or an airman in the airport somewhere, just walk up, out of the blue, thank them for what they're doing. I know they'll appreciate it. Thank you very much.
So in that spirit, let us also add our thanks and appreciation to a retired. Van, thank you very much for your service. We have a little, I apologize for being late. Thank you, Joe, for covering the introduction. We have time for a few more questions. If anyone has questions?
I have a question. I'm going to ask you a question. Well,
That's okay. I like questions.
And that is that it seems to me that in this day and age of the kids coming out of university and so forth not being able to find jobs, that the military provides an enormously effective training ground for that. And maybe you might, I don't know whether you might want to make any comments about that or not, but I don't know where that fits in your in your structure here.
Well, I didn't go in the military thinking I was going to be there for 35 years. I was going to do my 5 years that I owed for my scholarship, and then I was going to, I actually did job interviews in 1982. But at the end of it, for me, what I looked at was, and I had several friends and mentors that I talked to, was it was about my ability to make decisions. And I liked kind of how the military approached that. In submarines, we believe every individual officer or enlisted is a leader. And we push decisions to the lowest possible level. So if that's where your interests lie, or technology, I mentioned that young airman operating the space system. We have acquisition people that order and build tanks. I mean, you can. I have a. I guess the boyfriend of one of my daughters is an IT engineer for the U.S. Army. And so, whether it's actually in the military or working with the military, I think you're right. It is a great training ground. There's a lot to do. Now, they're obviously got to watch the budget climate. There's some stress in the military, just like there is anything in government right now with the downward pressure on the budget. The opportunities are really good. The military is hiring soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and they do every year. Maybe brings in about probably a couple thousand officers every year, and probably 30 or 40,000 sailors. Air Force, Army, and Marines are a proportional amount depending on their needs. Kind of what kept me was the ability to make decisions, but at the end of it, I got to like the work. And they kind of got to like what work I did. Military is an up or out organization. You know, you have to advance and continue to advance, or at some point they just come and say, well, we don't have anything else for you to do, and then you leave. I mean, it's you can retire. There's pretty good retirement programs, but the opportunity is contingent on your continuing to improve and contribute at a higher level. So that's kind of built into the service. Now, the military has a lot of people who come in and do one tour, and they're wonderful. And so, but I'll also caveat it, it's not for everybody. So, and I won't define those people who it's not for, because I've seen people come in the military. I had a young sailor, he just didn't fit. He really struggled with the idea of discipline and the authority. He ended up getting across the rocks with his boss, and they ended up in my office, and I gave him a second chance. And I just saw something in it, and I took a bit of a risk, and it turned out right. He turned out to have a long and productive career, but that doesn't always happen. I mean, you see that out in the military pretty much everywhere. I think it's a great career. Yes, sir.
I have a question for you. Thank you for your service. First off, as you recommended that we do. What your personal recommendations, or what are your thoughts on the articles that you've seen in the news regarding STRATCOM and the performance of our, I guess, the ICBM crews, whether it's the leadership and some of the issues they've had, or actual procedural issues?
Nuclear security, whether it is a TVA commercial nuclear power plant or a nuclear submarine or an ICBM, the standards are exacting and very high. And I'd like to say that we meet those standards 100% of the time, but the fact that we discover people who aren't meeting those standards is a good sign in my book. It says the leadership and the systems that are responsible for those standards of safety and security understand how high they are and are looking to make sure we're meeting them. And you as a citizen ought to, I mean, I hate to see people not do well, but if in that area, if they're not doing well, you want to know about it, and you want to either ask them to improve their performance, and sometimes they do, or maybe they can't. So it is, can be sad sometimes. I know some of those folks personally, But also the story is not yet complete. We only know what we read about in the media. And so the services are continuing their due process to sort out, and we may not hear if it's a personal discipline action that's determined, then we probably shouldn't expect to hear what that is, other than maybe discipline was taken, or they sometimes find other reasons, but some of those seem to be, based on what you read, they seem to be straightforward. But I think it's the standards are high, and they always have been. My personal experience in nuclear submarines is that's what you want. I mean, you want these submarines that operate nuclear power plants to be as safe as possible. The record shows that, but it's not without, you do find occasional people that aren't meeting the standard, and you identify those. You either retrain them. General Chilton had a great leadership example. He said if he discovers a problem, the first thing he does is he goes and asks the individual, did I give you the right guidance? Was it clear? Did you understand what I was asking you to do? The guy says, or lady says, yep. And he says, okay, did you have all the materials you need? Did you have the right books? Did you have the parts? Did you have the support from wherever you needed support from? And if the answer to that is yes, then the next question is did your leadership let you down? Did they not do something you needed it to do? And the answer to yes, that comes up, and that's when you just take the guy out. And, at some point, you've got to hold individual accountability. And that's the way the military looks at these things. Is if you go through the list of things that could cause this kind of a question, and it may end up at the individual level, and maybe that's what we're seeing. I don't know for sure. I don't have any inside detail.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You spoke briefly about, life flow training first responders. Do you guys work with the REACTS program at ORISE?
We have a good relationship with ORISE. I just don't know. That doesn't ring a bell. Other question? Yes, sir.
I have one. So I very much appreciated the picture of the submarine leaving New London by New London Ledge Light. I've watched that a few times on my tour. Good and bad memories. Usually good coming back. But,
I'll tell you, Ted brings up a great point. That first day on the 6-month run to the Mediterranean, morale is kind of, people are a little depressed, they're dragging around. But boy, coming back, they call that channel fever. Coming back up the channel, and everybody's kind of really excited, and they can see their families, and it's just a great feeling.
So a couple of years ago, there was a big shakeup in the submarine force, and they started allowing women to serve on submarines. And I haven't heard much about how that is perceived.
Well, I saw an article yesterday. Women have been included at the officer level on the ballistic missile and guided missile submarines, and that's going pretty well. I know it takes you about 18 months for an officer to go through a qualification program, so that you know this, so that you go all around the ship. You not only know your job, but you know a little bit about everybody's job, and it really gets into safety, knowing if you have some kind of casualty on the submarine, loss of power or something, you can be helpful no matter where you are. The first group of women completed those qualifications earlier this year, and that's a milestone. No problems. I mean, as a father of daughters, I've always thought that they should be on submarines, but that's just me. The article I read about is one of the challenges is segregation of berthing areas. Submarines weren't designed or built with berthing areas that are so you can give people some privacy. The surface ships were able to do that pretty readily, and so there's a fair amount of women. I think 15% of the Navy is women. Submarines are slowly working in that direction. The article I read yesterday was about the commander of the submarine force in Norfolk, talking about some of the changes they'll be making over the next several years to start filling out the crews with more women. Again, this is all voluntary. Submarine force has been volunteers since the year 1900 when the very first submarine was purchased by the U.S. Navy. Yes.
What is your view on, or what should the Navy be doing relative to sonar and whales?
Navy actually does a lot. We work with,
Some people say you kill a lot.
well, we work with the question, and it actually that issue's been to federal court several times. The Navy has been in court, and it boils down to an issue of national security versus the environment, and those are always interesting issues to discuss. The Navy has, we generally know where whales are inhabit, and those areas are known, and during the times of the year when we believe the whales are there, sonar actions are pretty much curtailed. Mostly the sonar is used for training. In submarines, we pretty much go around silent all the time. We're not transmitting sound into the water. Surface ships, same way, you don't need it. So it's operational training to be able to perform a wartime mission that requires the use of these high-powered sonars, because that's what you use to find other submarines or that are out there. So, given you have to do that training at some periodicity, find areas of the ocean where the animals are not there, and then only use absolutely what the power you need to use. So there's a lot of activity going on to try to do that. The Navy actively works that area.
Do you have research going on what are the levels that really need to be?
When I was there, we did. I don't know what they're doing today. I mean, Naval Research Lab has been in and out of that area for many years.
Yeah.
And so it is a concern to the Navy. I mean, we try to be very good stewards. The Navy tries to be very good stewards, in my experience, of the environment. Secretary of the Navy's had a lot of initiatives going in the I've read about in the last few years into biofuels and reducing energy consumption and a whole range of things. So that is an area that I think I'd say the Navy cares about.
Ben, if Howard students, after they graduate, would they go to work for the government, would they go to work for the military, or would they be civilians and do some of the stuff that you talked about?
You can join the military. You can go to work as a government civilian. One of my daughters is a government civilian in the intelligence community. Or you can do like me and be a contractor. And work all of the Navy's system. Navy doesn't build anything anymore. It's all built by contractors. Submarines are built by Electric Boat Corporation, and it used to be called Newport News Shipbuilding. It's got a different name now. And so that's just an example. You go to work as a contractor building defense equipment. So it's a wide open field. There's opportunities all over.
We try not to point it out for the Vice Admiral leader, but at least one of my former students is an Air Force officer. So,
I love the Air Force. I mean, they are a different culture than the Navy. But so is the Army, so is the Coast Guard. But the Air Force is a very professional organization. They get their share of interesting events as well. I met nothing but great professional, the vast majority of it. It's as professional as you want. Yes,
I have kind of a general question about PR to attract students into science, technology, engineering, math. Which is
now you're singing my song.
issue, yeah, but a broad issue. And how do you decide? I mean, there are probably all kinds of things about research that's going on and stuff that would be very exciting and would attract people and stuff. But then you always have to think about security. So how do you find that interface about what to reveal, to inspire, and to draw people in, and to get people to collaborate and so on, and yet you have to be careful about it. So that would seem to me to be a constant conundrum.
It is. The question's about maintaining the classified information you really need to keep classified, protect your ability to do national defense in the future. or to protect your people. And then how to attract people. So it's an interesting discussion. In one of my jobs, I was part of a team that was looking at the replacement to the Ohio-class submarine very early on. In other words, we recognized that the current class of submarines would eventually reach the end of its life, knowing that it takes 10 to 12 years to design and build the first submarine. We were doing just some early thinking about it, and we were meeting with one of the Navy civilian leaders, and he said, you ought to assume that everything you think is secret today, when that ship goes to sea, is going to be known. It's going to be public knowledge. So I'm not advocating that, but I think we see that the proliferation of information and the avenues to opportunities to read information and see what's out there and has resulted in a lot more, let's say, technological openness than when I was early in the Navy, when everything really was, you couldn't talk about it. My wife, when we went to sea on the submarine, had no idea where I was. Today, submarines can receive email while underway. You stick up an antenna and they get a radio transmission, and a whole bunch of email goes into the server, and then the sailors can read email. And then they can answer the email. Now, it might not go out right away. It might go out, in a few hours down the road when they go back up to communicate. But you can have that email communication. Now, obviously, there's some missions where they probably don't do that. But emails and cell phones, just to name a couple, have the internet has really exploded the amount of information. So, if you want to know what's going on, you can Google and come up with a pretty good load of information about in a particular field. So, if you're interested in space systems, just do some investigation. You can find out a lot about the satellites that are up there. There's probably some that you shouldn't find out about, but they're probably out there on the internet too.
One more question.
Yeah.
Van, the other day we were talking and you had some facts about females in the Coast Guard. I thought that might be interesting to share with us.
Coast Guard's had women in a lot longer than other services, so there's a much higher percentage. I don't know the exact percentage, but I guess it's probably almost 30 or 35%. And what you find in that, at least, and again, I'm not a Coast Guard officer, but what I've been told is that higher percentage has really resulted in a very good integration across the whole service. And so in the Navy, I mentioned we have when I was in the military a couple of years ago, we had about 15% of our force was women. Big difference between 15% and 30%, just in the terms of number of people around, number of mentors or leaders, interactions. The males need to learn. Okay? They need to learn that about the differences between the different approaches that people take, not just men and women, but that is the example I think we're talking about. The higher the percentage, I think, the easier it is for women. I don't know if you guys would have to say that. But it moves from being a man's world into something more balanced, and I think that's a good thing. That, to me, makes sense as far as the leadership and how the troops respond to the different kinds of leadership, and how you get the job done. At the end of the day, you got to get the mission done, no matter who the team is.
Let's thank our